In this clip, I want to introduce you to fiscal policy. Fiscal, not physical, fiscal policy. So what we're talking about here, remember, is this. We've got our basic identification of total spending, households, businesses, public sector, net exports. We've got our macroeconomic goals, which are effectively full employment, economic growth, price stability. That's our internal goals. So what I want to show you here today is what fiscal policy can do to influence the level of total spending to help us achieve a specific outcome. So fiscal policy simply refers to changes in government spending and changes in taxation. So changes in G and changes in T. Now, you'd remember we've alluded to the fact that governments derive what we call public sector revenue largely through imposing various taxes. G stands for government expenditure on public goods and services. So there's an aspect of this spending here which must take place because of the recognition that we've acknowledged governments undertake to provide law and order and public safety, the judiciary, a level of public hospitals and schools, etc., etc. So that's happening all the time. Now, if you've got a source of revenue and you've got expenditures happening, there's a possible number of what we call budget outcomes. The government, for example, could be running what we call a balanced budget. So let's start there, for example. Let's say the economy's bubbling along, relatively close to some notion of what we call full employment. And you know, George and I talked about that NRU, so let's say we're roughly there, and that G, government spending, is equal to T, tax revenue. And then we experience, for example, a downturn in economic activity which is beyond our control, e.g. a GFC, a global financial crisis. And what we saw there was that people lost confidence, they were uncertain and unsure about the future, so people actually, in order to protect or save for a rainy day, start to increase their savings, etc., etc. We found similarly a decrease in business optimism or business confidence, or an increase in pessimism. So we can see that our two major drivers in terms of private sector activity are diminishing, and quite possibly the global, remember, financial crisis meant that some of our trading partners were experiencing economic difficulties as well, so we can reasonably expect that our level of export sales to those countries is starting to diminish. So here we've got 1, 2, 3 of our components of total spending, and they're falling. And if they're going to fall, then you and I would actually anticipate, therefore, that we'd be moving down our business cycle, heading towards a trough or a slump or a recession. So what could the government do here? What could the government do? Well, already we would know that if economic activity is falling, their tax receipts are falling. So quite possibly they've slipped into a budget deficit, a non-discretionary deficit, mind you, because this is out of their control. So they're maintaining their level of public sector expenditure, but the revenues that they're deriving from economic activity is actually diminishing. We would expect the government to view this situation, okay, what we've got to do is to adopt what we call expansionary fiscal policy. So their intent would be to stimulate economic activity, to expand spending, expand output, etc. And of course to avoid the outcome of a recession, which of course would be rising unemployment. So what they might do for a start is to simply increase their own level of public sector spending. Now you can see that straight away, again, that would actually worsen the size of the deficit. But the theory is that if you stimulate economic activity, then at some stage in the future, when GDP is rising and expenditure is rising and unemployment is falling, there's more incomes to tax, ergo, tax revenues actually start to increase. And of course, the need for government sector spending on, say, unemployment benefits diminishes. So it's quite conceivable that at some stage in the future, you head back towards that, even though you are temporarily running what we might call a budget deficit. At the other end of the spectrum, let's say that the government was anticipating inflationary, or there was evidence of, say, demand pull inflation in the economy. In other words, remember, our total level of spending in this particular instance would be exceeding the economy's productive capacity. So as George and I talked about in our last video, there would be a need here to actually try and slow down or dampen or diminish the level of spending in order to take those inflationary pressures away. So to contract the economy, the government would actually do the exact opposite of this. In this particular case, they would actually diminish their own expenditure to take the sting out of surging demand, and one way of doing that, of course, will be to take away spending power from consumers, from businesses, by increasing, for example, tax rates, business taxes, etc., etc. Now, you can clearly see if you are diminishing your outlays but you're increasing your revenues, then you could conceivably running what we call a budget surplus. And that's quite often the outcome. When the economy's humming along, like really motoring along quite strongly, this is not an uncommon outcome, because quite simply because, as I said, your expectations in terms of G is actually declining and your receipts are actually increasing anyway. But the government can change these at their discretion. So here's our two broad approaches, if you like. We would want to expand the economy if we were fearful of a recession, and our outcome there would be to diminish cyclical unemployment. Contractionary, slowing down, dampening demand, total demand, and the idea there would be to avoid rapidly rising prices, which we've identified as demand pull inflation. Now, in a lot of countries like Australia, governments have actually taken more of a back seat with respect to fiscal policy than in previous years, and they've actually passed over demand management policies to monetary authorities. So in the next clip we'll have a look at what our central bank might do in these situations.